Sometimes the most beautiful connections happen between two souls that the world has given up on. In a dusty Arizona Territory auction yard, a broken mare trembles in the corner while cruel laughter fills the air around her. Jake Morrison, a poor cowboy with worn boots and empty pockets, sees what others cannot. While the crowd mocks the frail horse, Jake uses his last $2 to buy her. Everyone thinks he's made a terrible mistake. They have no idea that this beaten-down mare carries a secret that will change everything. Jake doesn't know it yet, but he's just purchased the fastest racehorse the territory has ever seen. The mare had been starved and broken by cruel owners who never discovered her true gift. Now, with gentle care and patient love, Jake will help her remember who she really is. But can one man's kindness really heal years of pain and neglect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather saddle hanging in Jake Morrison's cabin had seen better days. Cracked and worn smooth by countless hours in the Arizona sun, it was the only thing of value his father had left him along, with a head full of wisdom about horses and a heart that couldn't turn away from suffering. Jake ran his calloused fingers along the familiar grooves as he prepared for what many would call the foolishness of a desperate man. The morning after the auction, Jake stood in his modest, one-room cabin, watching dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight streaming through his single window. Outside, the mare he'd bought for his last $2 silver stood in the small corral, her ribs showing like the rungs of a ladder beneath her dull, matted coat. She hadn't moved from the far corner since he'd brought her home, and she flinched every time he approached. "Easy, girl," Jake murmured, stepping slowly toward the corral fence. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The mare's dark eyes watched him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion that reminded Jake of his own reflection some mornings. At 35, he'd worked ranches across the territory, always the reliable hand, never the owner. His calloused palms told the story of 1,000 head of cattle moved, 100 horses broken, and dreams that seemed to drift further away with each passing season. Dr. Samuel Miller arrived, just as Jake was attempting to offer the mare a handful of oats. The town's only veterinarian was a weathered man in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades healing animals and the people who loved them. "Jake, son, what in the Lord's name have you gotten yourself into?" Doc Miller asked, setting down his black medical bag and studying the mare with professional concern. "She needed someone, Doc. Couldn't let her go to the glue factory." Doc Miller nodded slowly, understanding more than Jake's words conveyed. He'd known Jake since the boy was knee-high to a grasshopper, and he'd watched him grow into a man whose heart was often larger than his pocket. "Let's have a look at what we're dealing with." The examination revealed what Jake had suspected, but hoped wasn't true. The mare showed signs of prolonged neglect and abuse. Old scars crisscrossed her flanks, and her hooves hadn't been properly trimmed in months. But Doc Miller's experienced hands also found something else good: bone structure, a strong heart, and beneath the neglect, the frame of a horse that had once been magnificent. "She's maybe 6, 7 years old," Doc Miller said, straightening his back with a slight grimace. "Good bloodlines from the look of her. Someone spent real money on this horse once upon a time." "What happened to her?" "Hard to say. Could be she was sold down the chain after an injury, or maybe her original owner fell on hard times. Either way, whoever had her last treated her like property, not a living creature." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough cruelty in his time men who took their frustrations out on animals that couldn't fight back. It made something cold and hard settle in his chest. Sarah Chen appeared at the corral fence, as if summoned by their conversation. The daughter of Chinese immigrants, she ran the general store with the efficiency of a field marshal and the warmth of a mother hen. Her long black hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her dark eyes held an intelligence that had intimidated more than one cowboy who'd tried to court her. "Jake Morrison, the whole town's talking about your auction purchase," she said, but her tone held no mockery. Mrs. Henderson said you've lost your mind, but I told her maybe you've found your heart. Jake felt heat rise to his cheeks. Sarah had that effect on him, making him feel like a schoolboy instead of a grown man who'd ridden with some of the toughest cowboys in the territory. She just needed someone to care, Jake said simply. Sarah's expression softened as she looked at the mare. What are you going to call her? Jake hadn't thought about a name. The auction papers listed her only as Bay Mare, age approx. 6. But looking at her now, trembling in the corner but still standing, still breathing, still hoping for something better, the name came to him naturally. Hope, he said. Her name is Hope. The mare's ears twitched at the sound, and for just a moment her eyes seemed to focus on Jake with something that might have been recognition. Tom Bradley chose that moment to ride up on his flashy sorrel gelding, his silver spurs jingling with each step. As foreman of the largest ranch in 3 counties, Bradley commanded respect through fear and intimidation. His cold blue eyes and permanent sneer had cowed many a cowboy, but Jake had never been one to back down from a bully. Morrison, Bradley said, not bothering to dismount. Heard you made quite the spectacle of yourself yesterday. Just bought a horse, Tom. Last I checked, that wasn't against the law. Bradley's laugh was harsh and humorless. Horse? That bag of bones? You'd have been better off burning your money for warmth. His gaze shifted to the mare, and Jake didn't like what he saw there. Course, if you decide you want to cut your losses, I might take her off your hands, for the right price. She's not for sale. Everything's for sale, Morrison, just a matter of finding the right price. Bradley's eyes lingered on Sarah before returning to Jake. You might want to remember that. After Bradley rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and unspoken threats, Doc Miller packed up his bag with deliberate slowness. That mare's going to need proper feed, regular medical attention, and time, he said. You got the resources for that kind of commitment. Jake looked at his empty pockets, his modest cabin, and the small savings he'd managed to scrape together over the years. Then he looked at Hope, still trembling but no longer cowering quite so deeply in the corner. I'll find a way, Doc. Sarah stepped closer, her hand briefly touching Jake's arm. The store gives credit to good customers, she said quietly, and I've always considered you good for your word. That evening, as the sun painted the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake sat on his porch step and watched Hope. She'd moved closer to the fence, close enough that he could see the intelligence in her dark eyes. There was something there, buried beneath the fear and pain, a spark that spoke of spirit not yet broken. His father's saddle creaked slightly in the evening breeze, hanging from its peg by the door. Jake could almost hear the old man's voice, patient and wise. Son, a horse ain't just muscle and bone. She's got a soul, same as you or me. You treat her right, and she'll give you everything she's got. You treat her wrong, and you'll break something that can't ever be fully mended. Jake stood slowly, his joints protesting after a long day of work. He'd lost his job at the Henderson Ranch the week before. Economic constraints, the old man had said, though Jake suspected Mrs. Henderson's disapproval of his softness with the animals had played a role. His savings would last maybe 2 months if he was careful, and Hope's care would require resources he wasn't sure he had. But as he looked at her, still standing despite everything she'd endured, Jake felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Purpose, direction. The sense that maybe, just maybe, he'd found the thing he was meant to do. Tomorrow we start over, girl, he said softly. Both of us. In the growing darkness, Hope turned her head toward the sound of his voice, and Jake could have sworn he saw her nod. Jake found the rusted bit and broken bridle buried in the corner of Hope's stall the next morning, hidden beneath moldy hay like shameful secrets. The metal was stained with old blood, and the leather showed gouges where desperate teeth had tried to find relief from pain. His hands shook as he held the cruel restraints, understanding now why Hope flinched every time he approached with any piece of tack. Jesus, he whispered, feeling sick to his stomach. The bit was designed not for communication but for punishment, spiked and twisted in ways that would cause agony with the slightest pressure. The bridle bore scars where it had been yanked and pulled, strips of leather worn thin from desperate struggles. These weren't tools for training, they were instruments of torture. Jake buried them behind his cabin, marking the spot with a simple wooden cross. Some things deserved a proper funeral, even if they were only symbols of cruelty. When he returned to the corral, Hope was watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. She'd moved to the center of the pen still, cautious, but no longer pressed against the farthest corner. It was progress, small but real. "I know what they did to you, girl," Jake said softly, settling himself on the ground just outside the fence. "And I promise you, on my father's grave, that nobody's ever going to hurt you like that again." Hope's ears swiveled toward his voice, and she took a tentative step forward. Then another. When she was close enough that Jake could see the scars around her muzzle where the cruel bit had done its work, she stopped and simply stood there, breathing. Dr. Miller arrived an hour later with Marcus Webb in tow, and Jake felt his stomach clench at the sight of the territory's wealthiest rancher. Webb owned more land than any three men needed, ran cattle from the Mexican border to the Colorado River, and had a reputation for getting what he wanted through whatever means necessary. "Morrison," Webb said, dismounting from his purebred stallion with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle. "Heard you made an interesting purchase yesterday." Webb was everything. Jake wasn't tall, handsome, wealthy, and cruel in the casual way of men who'd never known want. His clothes were custom-tailored, his boots hand-tooled leather, and his silver belt buckle alone was worth more than Jake made in 6 months. "Just bought a horse, Mr. Webb. Nothing interesting about that." Webb's pale eyes studied Hope with the calculating gaze of a predator. "That's no ordinary horse, Morrison. Look at that bone structure, the set of her head. That's breeding money can't buy." Doc Miller cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Jake, I brought Mr. Webb because I thought he might be able to tell us something about this mare's history." "History?" Jake kept his voice carefully neutral. Webb circled the corral slowly, his gaze never leaving Hope. The mare tensed as he approached, her nostrils flaring with remembered fear. "I've been tracking this horse for 2 years," Webb said finally. "She disappeared from a ranch up north. Owner claimed she was stolen, but I had my suspicions." "What kind of suspicions?" "The kind that involved debts and desperate men." Webb's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "This mare's got bloodlines that trace back to the finest racing stock in Kentucky. Her grandsire won the Belmont Stakes in '68. Jake felt something cold settle in his chest. Racing bloodlines meant more value than a poor cowboy could ever hope to protect. "That's impossible," Jake said. "She's half-starved and broken down." "Abuse can hide breeding, Morrison, but it can't erase it." Webb's eyes glittered with avarice. "I'll give you $50 for her, right now, cash money." $50 was more than Jake had seen in one place since his father died. It would keep him fed and housed for months, maybe long enough to find steady work. But looking at Hope, seeing the way she trembled whenever Webb moved, Jake felt his jaw set with stubborn determination. "She's not for sale." Webb's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his pale eyes. "Everything's for sale, Morrison, just a matter of finding the right price." "Not her." After Webb left with promises to think about this situation, Doc Miller stayed behind to examine Hope more thoroughly. His findings were both encouraging and troubling. "She's in better shape than I thought," he said, checking her legs with gentle, practiced hands. "Good, strong bones, no permanent damage to the joints." "But Jake," he paused, his weathered face serious. "This horse has been systematically broken, not just her body, but her spirit. Whoever had her used methods that would make a decent man sick. Can she recover?" "Physically. Given time and proper care, yes. Mentally?" Doc Miller shook his head. "That's harder to say. Horses remember everything, son. Every kindness, every cruelty. She's going to carry those scars for the rest of her life." That evening, Jake sat with Hope as the sun set behind the distant mountains. He'd brought a bucket of oats mixed with molasses, a luxury he couldn't afford, but had bought anyway with the last of his credit at Sarah's store. Hope approached cautiously, her muscles tense and ready to bolt, but hunger eventually overcame fear. As she ate, Jake began to talk. Not the baby talk some people used with animals, but real conversation, man to horse, soul to soul. "My daddy used to say that horses are God's way of showing us what grace looks like," he said quietly. "Said they were too good for this world, too pure. Maybe that's why some men feel the need to break them, because they can't stand to see something beautiful and whole." Hope's ears flicked toward his voice, and she paused in her eating to look at him. In the dying light, her dark eyes seemed to hold depths of understanding that took Jake's breath away. "I don't know what you were before they hurt you," Jake continued, "but I can see what you could be again. It's there, underneath all the fear and pain. You just need someone to help you remember." That night, Jake lay awake listening to the sounds of the desert coyotes calling in the distance, the whisper of wind through sagebrush, and closer, the soft sounds of Hope moving restlessly in her corral. He thought about Webb's words, about bloodlines and value, and the kind of money that could change a man's life forever. But more than that, he thought about the trust he'd seen, flickering in Hope's eyes, fragile as a candle flame in a hurricane. Some things were worth more than money. Some promises, once made, couldn't be broken without breaking something essential in yourself. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Jake rose and went to check on Hope. She was standing at the fence closest to his cabin, waiting. When she saw him, she nickered softly, the first sound he'd heard her make. It was a sound of greeting, of recognition, of the tentative beginning of trust. And Jake Morrison, poor cowboy with empty pockets and a heart full of hope, knew that his life had just changed forever. Jake carved the wooden brush from a piece of mesquite during the long evenings when Hope was still too nervous to let him close. Each stroke of his knife was deliberate, careful, shaped by hands that understood the value of patience. The brush was simply no fancy bristles or silver inlay, but it was made with love, and somehow Jake believed Hope would sense that difference. The first time he approached her with it, she bolted to the far corner of the corral, eyes rolling white with terror. But Jake had learned the rhythm of healing: advance slowly, retreat when necessary, never push beyond what trust could bear. He set the brush on a fence post and walked away, letting her see it, smell it, understand that it posed no threat. 3 days later, Hope let him touch her neck with his bare hand. 5 days after that, she stood still while he ran the wooden brush through her tangled mane. The first time he saw her actually lean into the gentle strokes, Jake had to turn away to hide the tears in his eyes. "You're remembering," he whispered, "remembering what it feels like to be cared for." Sarah Chen brought supplies every few days: grain, hay, liniment for Hope's legs, and coffee for Jake. She never stayed long, but Jake found himself looking forward to her visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the provisions she carried. "She's filling out," Sarah observed, watching Hope graze peacefully in the small paddock Jake had constructed. Her coat's starting to shine. It was true. 2 weeks of regular feeding and gentle care had begun to transform the broken mare. Her ribs were no longer visible. Her eyes held more alertness than fear. And sometimes Jake caught her watching him with what might have been curiosity rather than terror. "Doc Miller says another month, and she'll be strong enough for light training," Jake said, then immediately wondered why he'd mentioned training. He had no plans to ride Hope, no dreams beyond helping her heal. Sarah's dark eyes studied his face with the perception of a woman who saw more than most people revealed. "What will you do when she's well?" Jake didn't have an answer. He'd been living day to day, focused only on Hope's immediate needs, pushing aside thoughts of the future or the dwindling supplies in his cabin. His last dollar had been spent 3 days ago, and credit could only stretch so far. Marcus Webb arrived the next morning with Tom Bradley at his side, both men mounted on expensive horses that gleamed with professional grooming. Jake was in the corral with Hope, brushing her legs with careful strokes when their shadows fell across the ground. "Morrison," Webb called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of wealth. "Thought I'd check on your progress with that mare." Hope tensed at the sound of Webb's voice, pressing closer to Jake's side. Her trembling communicated more than words ever could about the nature of her past encounters with powerful men. "She's doing fine, Mr. Webb. Thanks for asking." Webb dismounted and approached the fence with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. "I've been thinking about our last conversation. That $50 offer might have been hasty. I'm prepared to be more generous." Jake continued brushing Hope's legs, but his shoulders tightened. "Told you before, she's not for sale." $75, Webb said, as if Jake hadn't spoken. "Cash money. More than you'll see in 6 months of honest work." Bradley leaned forward in his saddle, his cold smile predatory. "Might be the only offer you get, Morrison. Word around town is you're behind on your bills." The words hit home because they were true. Jake owed Sarah $60 for grain and supplies, Dr. Miller $20 for Hope's medical care, and the bank another $30 for the loan against his father's saddle. His small savings were gone, exhausted by Hope's needs and his own inability to find steady work. "Horse looks better," Webb continued, studying Hope with calculating eyes. "Good thing, too. Hate to see all your hard work go to waste when the bank forecloses." Jake's hand stilled on Hope's leg. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Means money talks, Morrison, and right now, yours ain't saying much." After the two men left, Jake sat heavily on his porch step, the weight of reality settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Hope approached the fence nearest to him, extending her head over the rails in a gesture that spoke of trust and affection. When he reached up to stroke her muzzle, she didn't pull away. "I'm trying, girl," he said quietly, "but I don't know how long I can keep this up." That evening, Sarah appeared at his cabin door with a basket covered by a red-checkered cloth. Inside were fresh bread, stew still warm from her kitchen, and a jar of peach preserves that Jake knew she'd been saving for a special occasion. "You don't need to," he began, but Sarah cut him off with a look. "Don't be proud to the point of stupidity, Jake Morrison. Friends help friends." They sat on his porch as the desert cooled around them, sharing the meal in comfortable silence. Hope grazed nearby, no longer nervous about Sarah's presence, occasionally lifting her head to watch them with what Jake had learned to recognize as contentment. "She trusts you," Sarah said finally. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of that trust like a sacred responsibility. "Sometimes I think she understands more than she lets on, like she's just waiting for something. Maybe she's waiting for you to believe in her the way she's learning to believe in you." The words stayed with Jake long after Sarah had gone home. That night, he dreamed of running not from something, but toward it. In the dream, Hope moved beneath him with fluid grace, her powerful strides eating up the desert ground while the wind sang through her mane. When he woke, Jake could still feel the phantom rhythm of her movement, still hear the thunder of hooves on hard-packed earth. It was just a dream, he told himself. Hope was healing, yes, but she was still fragile, still haunted by her past. The idea of her as a racehorse of unleashing the speed and power that might lie dormant in her bloodlines seemed as distant as the stars. But in the growing light of dawn, as he watched Hope stretch and move around her paddock with increasing fluidity, Jake found himself wondering what she might become if given the chance. Not just healed, but whole. Not just surviving, but thriving. For the first time since buying her, Jake allowed himself to dream of possibilities beyond mere recovery. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and wondering what it would feel like to fly. Jake almost missed the faded blue ribbon tangled in Hope's mane. It was while he was grooming her on a particularly warm morning, working carefully through the knots that still caught his wooden brush, when his fingers found the silk strand woven deep among the dark strands of hair. The ribbon was sun-bleached and dirty, barely recognizable as something that had once been bright and proud. But old Pete Hawkins recognized it immediately. "Well, I'll be damned," the ancient cowboy said, squinting at the ribbon through rheumy eyes. Pete had worked horses in the territory for more than 50 years, and his memory held decades of bloodlines, races, and stories that younger men had forgotten. "That there's a winner's ribbon from the Tucson Stakes," 72. Jake's heart stumbled in his chest. You sure about that, Pete? Sure as sunrise. I was there when Desert Wind took that race. Prettiest filly you ever did see, ran like her tail was on fire. Pete's weathered fingers traced the ribbon's faded edges. This here horse of yours, she got a brand anywhere? They found it on Hope's left shoulder, partially obscured by the thick winter coat she was finally healthy enough to grow. The mark was Elegantus stylized, DW, surrounded by what might once have been decorative flourishes. Desert Wind. Sweet mother of pearl, Pete breathed. Son, you know what you got here. Jake shook his head, not trusting his voice. Desert Wind was the fastest horse in 3 territories. Won 14 races in 2 seasons before she disappeared. Folks said she was stolen. Others claimed she died of colic. But nobody ever knew for sure. Pete looked at Hope with new eyes, seeing past the scars and the fear to the champion that had once commanded crowds and prize money. She was worth more than most men see in a lifetime. That afternoon, Jake sat with Hope in the paddock, trying to reconcile the trembling, broken animal he'd rescued with the legendary racehorse Pete described. Hope seemed to sense his contemplation, moving closer than usual, resting her head against his shoulder in a gesture of trust that still amazed him. "Is it true, girl?" he asked quietly. "Were you really Desert Wind?" As if in answer, Hope lifted her head and moved away from him with a fluid grace that Jake had been too focused on her healing to properly notice. For just a moment, watching her trot across the paddock, he caught a glimpse of what she might have been powerful hindquarters driving her forward, head held high, moving with the effortless efficiency of an athlete born to run. Then she returned to his side, nickering softly, and became again the gentle, healing creature he'd been caring for. Sarah arrived that evening with news that made Jake's blood run cold. "Marcus Webb's been asking questions about you," she said without preamble, "and about Hope." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that involve lawyers and property claims." Sarah's dark eyes were troubled. "Mrs. Henderson came into the store this afternoon. She said Webb's been spreading word that you might have stolen goods on your property." Jake felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "That's impossible. I bought her fair and square at auction." "Auction papers don't always tell the whole story, Jake. If someone filed a theft claim on that horse years ago, and if Webb has connections to track down the original owner's heirs." Sarah didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. That night, Jake lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through possibilities and scenarios, none of them good. If Webb could prove Hope had been stolen property, he could claim her as recovered goods. If he had enough legal weight behind him, Jake's auction purchase would mean nothing. But more troubling than the legal implications was the growing certainty that Hope truly was Desert Wind. The way she moved when she thought no one was watching, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the proud set of her head when something caught her attention, these weren't the traits of an ordinary range horse. Morning brought Dr. Miller and troubling news. "Jake, I need to tell you something about that mare," Doc said, his weathered face grave. "I've been thinking about what Pete told you, about her being Desert Wind, so I did some checking with colleagues up north." Jake's stomach clenched. "And?" "She disappeared from the Lazy S ranch in '73. Owner named Samuel Garrett claimed she was stolen, but there were rumors debts, gambling problems, men who collected on loans in ways that didn't involve banks." "You think Garrett sold her to pay debts?" "I think Garrett was desperate enough to do whatever kept him breathing, and I think Hope ended up in the hands of men who saw her only as property to be used up." Doc Miller's eyes were sad but determined. "The abuse she suffered, Jake, it wasn't random cruelty. Someone was trying to break her completely, destroy any spirit or speed she might have had left. Why would they do that? Because a broken-down nag draws no attention. Desert Wind would have been recognized anywhere in the territory. But a starved, beaten mare nobody would look at twice. She could disappear completely. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture that made Jake sick to his stomach. Hope hadn't just been abused, she'd been deliberately destroyed. transformed from a champion into a ghost of her former self to hide her identity. That evening, for the first time since bringing Hope home, Jake halted her and led her out of the paddock. She followed willingly, trusting his guidance, but he could feel the tension in her body as they moved onto open ground. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "Just want to see something." He led her to the flat stretch of land behind his cabin, a natural straightaway that ran for almost a quarter-mile before reaching a fence line. Then, heart pounding with anticipation and fear, Jake unclipped the lead rope and stepped back. Hope stood motionless for a long moment, confused by her sudden freedom. Then, as if some buried instinct finally awakened, she lifted her head and looked down the long stretch of open ground. What happened next took Jake's breath away. Hope didn't run, she exploded into motion. Her powerful hindquarters drove her forward with such sudden force that Jake stumbled backward in surprise. But it wasn't just her speed that amazed him. It was the transformation in her entire being. Gone was the timid, broken creature he'd been nursing back to health. In her place was a magnificent athlete, running with joy and power, and a grace that brought tears to Jake's eyes. She covered the quarter-mile in what seemed like seconds, then wheeled at the fence and came thundering back, her mane streaming behind her like a war banner. When she finally slowed and trotted back to where Jake stood slack-jawed with amazement, she was breathing hard but not labored, her eyes bright with an excitement he'd never seen before. "My God," Jake whispered, reaching up to stroke her neck. "You really are her, aren't you?" Hope nuzzled his shoulder, then looked back down the straightaway, as if asking permission to run again. For the first time since buying her, Jake began to understand the true magnitude of what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about rescuing an abused horse. This was about resurrection, bringing back to life something that cruel men had tried to destroy forever. And somewhere in the depths of his heart, a dream began to take shape. Not just healing, but redemption. Not just survival, but triumph. Jake's father's silver pocket watch had kept perfect time for 30 years, its steady tick a metronome of reliability in an uncertain world. Now Jake used it to time Hope's runs, standing at the quarter-mile mark with the watch in his palm, heart hammering as he watched her transform from gentle companion to thundering champion. 43 seconds, then 41. Then, on a morning when the desert air was crisp and Hope seemed to float above the ground rather than touch it, 38 seconds for the quarter-mile. "That's impossible," Jake breathed, staring at the watch face as if it might be lying to him. But Hope stood before him, sides heaving slightly, eyes bright with the joy of running, and Jake knew the watch told the truth. He'd just witnessed a time that would have won races at tracks from Denver to San Antonio. Dr. Miller arrived to find Jake sitting on a fence rail, staring at Hope with the expression of a man who'd discovered gold in his backyard. "She's been running," Doc observed, noting Hope's elevated breathing and the satisfied gleam in her dark eyes. "Doc, you need to see this. Time her yourself if you don't believe me." Jake's voice carried an excitement that made the older man raise his eyebrows. They set up an official timing run. Doc Miller positioned himself at the finish line with his own pocket watch, while Jake led Hope to the starting point. Sarah had arrived by then, drawn by some instinct that told her something momentous was happening. Even old Pete had hobbled over from his shack, drawn by rumors of impossible speed. "Ready?" Jake called out. "Ready," Doc Miller replied, thumb poised over his watch stem. Jake released Hope with a gentle slap on her rump, and she was gone. Not running flying. Her hooves barely seemed to touch the ground as she stretched out in a gallop that left observers speechless. The thunder of her hooves created a rhythm that matched the pounding of Jake's heart. 37 seconds, Doc Miller announced, his voice hushed with awe. Old Pete let out a whoop that probably scared every jackrabbit for miles. "Sweet Jesus in heaven, she's still got it. Desert Wind lives." But their celebration was short-lived. Marcus Webb's arrival cast a shadow over the gathering like storm clouds over a picnic. He sat his expensive stallion with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never doubted his own power. but Jake could see the calculation in his pale eyes as he watched Hope cool down from her run. "Impressive display, Morrison," Webb said, his voice carrying undertones Jake didn't like. "Very impressive indeed." "Just giving her some exercise," Jake replied carefully. Webb's smile was cold as winter steel. "Exercise? Yes, I can see that." He paused, letting his gaze linger on Hope's still heaving flanks. "You know, I've been doing some research into that mare's bloodlines. Fascinating history." Jake felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression neutral. "That so?" "Indeed, it seems Desert Wind's disappearance left quite a legal tangle. Original ownership papers, insurance claims, questions about theft versus legitimate sale." Webb's smile widened, revealing teeth like a predator's. "Complex situation, the kind that requires expensive lawyers to sort out." "Jake bought her fair and square at auction," Sarah said, stepping protectively closer to Jake's side. Webb's attention shifted to her with the lazy focus of a snake eyeing prey. "Miss Chen, how lovely to see you again. Yes, auction sales are usually quite legitimate. Unless, of course, the seller didn't actually own what he was selling." Dr. Miller cleared his throat. "Mr. Webb, I hope you're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Doctor. I'm simply noting that legal complications can be very expensive to resolve, even when one is entirely innocent." Webb's gaze returned to Jake. "Of course, I might be willing to help resolve such complications for the right consideration." After Webb left, taking his threats and implications with him, the small group stood in uncomfortable silence. Hope had approached Jake during the confrontation, pressing against his side as if sensing his distress. Her presence was comforting, but it also underscored the magnitude of what he stood to lose. "He's going to try to take her," Sarah said quietly. Jake nodded, his jaw tight with determination. "Let him try." But even as he spoke the words, Jake knew bravado wouldn't be enough. Webb had money, connections, and the ruthless patience of a man who'd built an empire by taking what he wanted. All Jake had was love for a horse and a stubborn refusal to surrender what was right. That evening, Jake began Hope's real training in earnest. Not just exercise runs, but the systematic development of her speed, stamina, and racing instincts. He started with basic conditioning, long, steady gallops that built her wind and strengthened muscles that had been weakened by abuse and neglect. Hope seemed to understand what was being asked of her. She responded to Jake's guidance with eager intelligence, pushing herself harder each day, as if she too could sense the approaching storm and was preparing for battle. Sarah became an unofficial part of the training team, arriving each morning with supplies and staying to help with timing runs and conditioning exercises. Her presence gave Jake strength he hadn't known he needed, and he began to understand that what was growing between them was as important as Hope's recovery. "She's getting stronger every day," Sarah observed, watching Hope cool down from a particularly intense workout. "But Jake, what are you planning? You can't just train a racehorse in secret forever." Jake had been wrestling with the same question. Hope's speed was undeniable. She was running times that would dominate any race in the territory. But speed alone wouldn't protect her from Webb's legal maneuvering or his willingness to use force when law failed him. "There's a territorial championship race coming up in 6 weeks," Jake said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. "Winner takes $500 and the title of fastest horse in Arizona territory." Sarah's eyes widened. "Jake, you can't be serious. The entry fee alone is more money than you've seen in years." $25, Jake confirmed, "and I don't have it. But if I could find a way to enter, if Hope could win." He trailed off, but the implication hung in the air between them. A public victory would establish Hope's value and identity beyond any doubt. It would also provide the prize money Jake desperately needed to fight Webb's legal challenges. But more than that, it would vindicate everything Jake had believed about Hope from the moment he'd seen her cowering in that auction pen. "It's dangerous," Sarah said quietly. "If Webb realizes what you're planning, he already knows something's happening. Might as well make it count." That night, Jake sat with Hope, under a canopy of desert stars, his father's watch ticking steadily in his pocket. The mare grazed peacefully nearby, but occasionally she would lift her head and look toward the flat stretch where they'd been training, as if she too was dreaming of speed and competition. "What do you think, girl?" Jake asked softly. "Ready to show the world who you really are?" Hope approached him in the darkness, nuzzling his shoulder with gentle affection. But in her dark eyes, Jake saw something that hadn't been there during her weeks of healing fire. The competitive spirit that had made Desert Wind a champion was awakening, fueled by Jake's belief and care. For the first time since Webb's threats, Jake allowed himself to hope, not just for survival, but for triumph. Not just for keeping hope, but for proving that sometimes love and patience could overcome wealth and cruelty. The race was 6 weeks away. It would be the greatest challenge either of them had ever faced. But Jake was beginning to believe they just might be ready for it. The legal document arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous boy from the county seat who wouldn't meet Jake's eyes as he handed over the official envelope. Jake's hands shook as he read the formal language that boiled down to a simple, devastating message. Marcus Webb was claiming ownership of Hope based on her identity as stolen property, and Jake had 30 days to prove his legal right to keep her. Jake read the document 3 times, each reading making the situation clearer and more hopeless. Webb had somehow tracked down the heir to Samuel Garrett's estateer nephew in California, who'd signed over all claims to the missing racehorse in exchange for what the papers delicately termed consideration received. Webb now possessed what appeared to be legitimate ownership documents for Desert Wind, dating back to before her disappearance. "Bastard!" Jake whispered, crumpling the papers in his fist. Hope looked up from her grazing, sensing his distress. She approached the fence with the gentle concern that had characterized their relationship from the beginning, extending her muzzle toward him in silent comfort. "I won't let him take you," Jake promised, stroking her neck. "I don't know how yet, but I won't let it happen." Dr. Miller arrived within the hour, having been summoned by Sarah, who'd witnessed Jake's reaction to the legal papers. The older man's face was grim as he read through Webb's claim. "It's clever," Doc admitted reluctantly. "If Desert Wind was indeed stolen from the Lazy S Ranch, and if Garrett never legally transferred ownership before his death, then technically Webb might have a legitimate claim." "But Jake bought her at a legal auction," Sarah protested. "That has to count for something." "It does, but only if the seller had clear title, if the horse was stolen goods." Doc Miller shook his head. "Jake, you need a lawyer. A good one." Jake laughed bitterly. "With what money? I can barely afford to feed her, let alone hire legal counsel." The 3 of them stood in uncomfortable silence, the weight of the situation settling over them like dust after a windstorm. Hope continued, grazing peacefully, unaware that her future hung in the balance of human greed and legal maneuvering. That afternoon brought worse news. Tom Bradley arrived with an eviction notice from the bank, informing Jake that his loan against his father's saddle was in default and that he had 2 weeks to vacate the property. "Funny how these things all happen at once," Bradley said with his cold smile. "Almost like someone's been pulling strings." Jake studied the foreman's face, seeing the satisfaction there. "Webb put you up to this." "Mr. Webb's a businessman, Morrison. He sees opportunities where other men see problems." Bradley's gaze shifted to Hope. "Shame to see a good horse go to waste on account of a man's pride." After Bradley left, Jake sat heavily on his porch step, feeling the weight of defeat pressing down on his shoulders. Everything was falling apart: his home, his future, and worst of all, his ability to protect Hope from the forces arrayed against them. Sarah found him there, as the sun was setting, staring at the horizon with the hollow expression of a man who'd run out of options. "There has to be something we can do," she said, settling beside him on the step. "Like what? I've got no money, no property, and apparently no legal claim to the one thing that matters most." Jake's voice was flat with exhaustion. "Maybe I should just take Webb's offer and cut my losses." "You don't mean that?" Jake looked at Hope, peacefully grazing in the growing dusk, and felt something break inside his chest. "Maybe I do. At least with Webb she'd be fed, housed, cared for. Better than watching her starve because I'm too stubborn to admit when I'm beaten. Sarah's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. Jake Morrison, I've known you for 3 years. You're many things: stubborn, proud, sometimes foolish, but you're not a quitter. And that horse didn't survive everything she's been through, just to give up now. That night, Jake lay awake planning desperate strategies. He could run, take Hope, and head for Mexico or California, try to disappear before Webb's legal machinery could catch up with them. But that would make him a horse thief in truth, confirming every accusation Webb had made. He could fight the legal battle, but that required resources he didn't possess. Even if he somehow won, he'd be bankrupted by the process. Or he could do something so audacious, so impossible, that it might just work. The territorial championship race was 4 weeks away. The entry fee was $25, money Jake didn't have. But the winner's purse was $500, enough to hire the best lawyers in the territory and fight Webb's claim properly. More importantly, a public victory would establish Hope's current identity and value beyond any legal doubt. If she won the championship as Hope, owned by Jake Morrison, it would be much harder for Webb to claim her as the stolen desert wind. The plan was desperate, dangerous, and probably doomed to failure. But it was the only chance they had. Jake rose before dawn and went to Hope's corral. She was already awake, watching him approach with the intelligent awareness that never failed to amaze him. "What do you say, girl?" he asked softly, ready to bet everything on one race. Hope approached the fence and nuzzled his hand, her dark eyes reflecting starlight and something that might have been understanding. Jake made his decision. They would enter the championship race, somehow. They would train harder than ever before. And they would prove to the world that some things, love, loyalty, the bond between a man and his horse, were worth more than money or legal documents. The next morning, Jake walked into Sarah's store with a proposal that would change both their lives forever. "I need $25, he said without preamble, for the race entry fee. Sarah looked up from her ledgers, studying his face with careful attention. "That's a lot of money, Jake." "I know, and I've got nothing to offer as collateral, except my word that I'll pay it back with interest when Hope wins." "When she wins?" Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Not if." "When," Jake repeated firmly, "because she's going to win, Sarah. I've seen what she can do, and I believe in her. The question is whether you believe in me." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. Then she moved to her cash box and counted out 25 silver dollars, placing them on the counter between them. "I don't believe in you, Jake Morrison," she said quietly. "I know you, and knowing you is enough." As Jake's fingers closed around the entry fee, he felt hope kindle in his chest for the first time in days. The race was 3 weeks away. It would be the longest 3 weeks of his life, but for the first time since Webb's legal threat, Jake believed they had a fighting chance. Outside, Hope was waiting at the fence, as if she sensed that their real journey was just beginning. The yellowed photograph fell from between the pages of his father's Bible like a leaf from a dying tree. Jake had been searching through his few possessions, looking for anything of value he might sell to fund Hope's training, when the old daguerreotype fluttered to the floor. The image was faded but clear: a young man in working clothes standing beside a magnificent bay filly, both of them posed in front of a barn Jake didn't recognize. On the back, in his father's careful handwriting, "Desert Wind and Me, 1870, 1. Samuel Garrett's place. She was something special." Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph. His father had known Hope, had trained her, had been there during her early years, before the abuse, before the fear, before the long journey that had brought her to that auction yard. Dr. Miller's reaction to the photograph was immediate and profound. "My God, Jake, your father never told you." "Told me what?" Jake's voice was barely a whisper. "Thomas Morrison was the finest horse trainer in 3 territories. Before you were born, before he settled down to ranch work, he trained champions. Desert Wind was his masterpiece." Doc Miller studied the photograph through his wire-rimmed spectacles. He broke her as a yearling, trained her for 2 seasons. When she started winning races, she made his reputation. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. All those evenings listening to his father's stories about horses, all the gentle wisdom about reading their souls and earning their trust, it had been born from experience with the very horse now standing in Jake's corral. Why didn't he ever tell me? Because of what happened next, Doc Miller said grimly. Samuel Garrett got deep in debt to some bad men. Your father begged him not to sell Desert Wind, offered to buy her himself even though he couldn't afford it. But Garrett was desperate, and he sold her to a man named Curtis Brennan. Jake had heard that name whispered in bars and around campfires. Brennan, who ran horses until they died, who broke spirits for sport, who saw animals as nothing more than property to be used up and discarded. Brennan destroyed her, Doc continued, used her hard, abused her, tried to break her completely when she wouldn't perform for him the way she had for your father. By the time she escaped or was stolen, depending on who tells the story, she was a shadow of what she'd been. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Hope's instant trust in Jake hadn't been miraculous, it had been recognition. She'd known his scent, his touch, the genetic echo of hands that had once cared for her with love and patience. She remembers, Jake breathed. She remembers my father. That evening, Jake sat with Hope as the desert cooled around them, the photograph in his hands. Hope approached him with unusual boldness, nuzzling the image as if she too could see the young man who'd once been her world. You knew him, didn't you, girl? Jake said softly. You knew my daddy. Hope's response was to press her head against Jake's chest, a gesture of trust and affection that suddenly carried the weight of history. She wasn't just accepting Jake's care, she was recognizing the son of the man who'd first taught her that humans could be kind. But the photograph's revelation carried a darker truth. If Thomas Morrison had trained Desert Wind, if he'd been present during her early racing career, then Marcus Webb's ownership claims became even more complex. Webb hadn't just targeted Hope, randomly he'd been hunting for Desert Wind specifically, and somehow he'd discovered the connection to Jake's father. The confirmation came the next morning in the form of Marcus Webb himself, arriving with a lawyer and a smug expression that made Jake's blood boil. Morrison, Webb said, dismounting from his stallion with practiced grace. I see you've been doing some family research. Jake's hand instinctively went to his shirt pocket, where the photograph rested against his heart. Webb's pale eyes caught the gesture, and his smile widened. Oh yes, I know about Thomas Morrison and Desert Wind. Fascinating story, really. The trainer who couldn't save his masterpiece from cruel men. Webb's voice carried mock sympathy that fooled no one. I suppose there's a certain poetic justice in the fact that his son can't save her either. You planned this, Jake said, understanding flooding through him. You knew who she was all along. You've been setting this up from the beginning. Webb's lawyer, a thin, nervous man in an expensive suit, cleared his throat. Mr. Morrison, my client has a legal obligation to recover stolen property, regardless of any personal connections you might imagine. Imagine? Jake's voice rose with anger. You son of a... Jake. Dr. Miller's restraining hand on his arm prevented him from saying something that would land him in jail. Let them talk. Webb studied Hope, who had retreated to the far corner of her corral at the sight of the strange men. She looks well. Your father would be proud of the care you've given her. Shame it's all been wasted effort. The casual cruelty of the words hit Jake like a physical blow. Webb wasn't just stealing Hope, he was desecrating the memory of everything Jake's father had stood for. She's not going anywhere, Jake said quietly. Actually, she is. Webb's lawyer produced another set of legal documents. We have a court order for immediate seizure of the animal pending resolution of ownership claims. Sheriff Bradley will be here within the hour to enforce it. Jake felt the world spinning around him. Tom Bradley wasn't just Webb's foreman, he was the sheriff's brother, which explained how Webb had managed to get such swift legal action. You can't do this, Sarah said, arriving in time to hear the lawyer's pronouncement. She hasn't had her day in court. She will, Webb replied smoothly. But in the meantime, stolen property must be secured in proper custody. His gaze fixed on Jake with predatory satisfaction. Don't worry, Morrison. I'll take good care of her, train her properly, maybe even race her again, when she's ready. After Webb and his lawyer left, Jake stood staring at Hope with the hollow feeling of a man watching his world collapse. In 1 hour, Sheriff Bradley would arrive to take her away. Everything Jake had worked for, every moment of trust he'd built with Hope, would be destroyed by the cold machinery of law and wealth. There has to be something, Sarah said desperately, some legal avenue. No, Jake said quietly. There isn't. Webb's got the money, the connections, and apparently the law on his side. But as he spoke the words, Jake felt something stir in his chest, not despair, but defiance. His father had tried to save Desert Wind through legal means and failed. But Thomas Morrison had never had what Jake possessed, now the unbreakable bond forged through weeks of patient care and the knowledge that Hope trusted him completely. If the law wouldn't protect her, maybe it was time to move beyond the law. Jake walked to Hope's corral and opened the gate. She approached him immediately, pressing her muzzle against his hand in the gesture of trust that had become as natural as breathing. "What do you say, girl?" Jake whispered. "Ready to run?" Hope's ears pricked forward, and in her dark eyes, Jake saw not just understanding but eagerness. She was ready. They both were. The territorial championship race was 2 weeks away. If Jake could keep Hope hidden until then, if they could reach the race grounds without being caught, they might have one chance to prove her worth publicly before Webb's legal machinery could destroy them both. It was desperate, dangerous, and probably impossible. It was also their only hope. The championship race entry form was creased and worn from Jake's nervous handling, but the official seal made it legally binding. As long as Hope appeared at the starting line on race day, she would be recognized as a legitimate competitor, regardless of any ownership disputes. It was a thin legal shield, but it was all they had. Jake had been hiding with Hope in the canyon country for 10 days, moving from waterhole to waterhole, staying ahead of Webb's search parties through knowledge of terrain earned over a lifetime of desert living. Hope had adapted to their fugitive existence with remarkable resilience, as if she understood that their survival depended on stealth and endurance. Sarah found them at dawn on the 11th day, following trails that only someone raised in this harsh country could read. She brought supplies, news, and a worry that had carved lines around her dark eyes. "The whole territory's talking about it," she said, unpacking jerky, grain, and coffee from her saddlebags. "Some folks think you've lost your mind. Others are calling you the biggest fool since Custer. But Jake," she paused, meeting his eyes directly, "some are calling you a hero." Jake laughed bitterly, gesturing at their makeshift camp among the rocks. "Hero? I'm a horse thief hiding in the desert. You're a man fighting for what's right against impossible odds. That's the definition of heroic, even if it's also the definition of foolish." Hope had grown stronger during their time in the wilderness, her desert-hardened ancestry serving her well in conditions that would have broken softer horses. Her coat gleamed with health, her eyes were bright with intelligence, and when Jake took her out for training runs on the flat stretches between mesas, she moved with a power and grace that took his breath away. "She's ready," Sarah observed, watching Hope cool down from a particularly impressive workout. "Question is, are you?" Jake considered the question seriously. Physically, he was as prepared as he could be. He'd lost weight during their time hiding, his body hardened by constant vigilance and sparse meals. Hope responded to his lightest touch, their communication refined to an almost telepathic level through weeks of mutual dependence. But emotionally, Jake felt the weight of everything they were risking. If they lost the race, Hope would be seized immediately. If they won but were disqualified on ownership grounds, the victory would be meaningless. And if Webb had prepared some trap they hadn't anticipated, they might not survive the attempt. "I keep thinking about my father," Jake admitted. "He tried to do the right thing with Desert Wind, and it destroyed him. Losing her broke something inside him that never healed." "You're not your father, Jake, and this isn't his story, it's yours." That afternoon, Dr. Miller arrived with news that chilled Jake's blood. Webb had imported a horse from California, proven champion named Thunder Strike, who'd never lost a race. The message was clear. Webb wasn't just planning to win Hope through legal means. He intended to humiliate her publicly, proving that money and professional training would always triumph over love and determination. "The odds are running 10-1 against you," Doc Miller reported. "Thunder Strike's won 18 straight races. His jockey's a professional who's ridden winners from San Francisco to New Orleans." Jake absorbed this information with the calm of a man who'd already accepted impossible odds. What about the other competition? 15 horses entered, but only 3 besides Thunderstrike have any real chance. Webb's made sure this isn't just a race, it's a statement about the natural order of things. That evening, as they prepared for the final approach to the race grounds, Jake sat with Hope under a canopy of desert stars. Tomorrow would determine everything, their future, their freedom, the vindication of every moment they'd shared since that first day at the auction. "I need you to know something, girl," Jake said quietly, stroking her neck with hands that had learned to read her moods like scripture. "Whatever happens tomorrow, these weeks we've had together have been the best of my life. You've taught me things about trust and courage that I never knew before." Hope turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting starlight and something deeper, a recognition of the bond they'd forged through adversity. "My father always said horses were God's way of showing us what grace looked like," Jake continued. "I never understood what he meant until I met you. You've been grace to me, Hope. Pure grace." Sarah had stayed with them for the final night, understanding that their small group might never be together again after tomorrow. As they sat around their carefully concealed campfire, she voiced the fear that haunted all of them. What if we're wrong? What if she's not fast enough? Jake had wondered the same thing during the long nights of hiding. Hope's training times suggested she was capable of winning, but race conditions were different from solitary runs in the desert. The pressure of competition, the presence of other horses, the roar of the crowdle of these factors could affect her performance in ways they couldn't predict. "Then we lose with honor," Jake said finally. "But Sarah, I've seen her run, really run, with joy and power and freedom. Whatever else happens, we've given her that." They broke camp before dawn, beginning the careful approach to Tucson and the territorial championship grounds. Hope seemed to sense the significance of the day. She carried herself with a alertness and energy that spoke of anticipation rather than fear. The race grounds were already bustling with activity when they arrived. Horses were being walked, trainers shouted instructions, and early spectators claimed the best viewing positions. The atmosphere was electric, with the kind of excitement that only came with high stakes and uncertain outcomes. Webb was there, of course, supervising the preparation of Thunderstrike with the attention of a general deploying troops. The California horse was magnificent, perfectly proportioned, professionally groomed, and carrying himself with the arrogant confidence of proven superiority. When Webb spotted Jake leading Hope toward the registration area, his smile was sharp as a blade. "Morrison," he called out, loud enough for nearby spectators to hear, "I have to admire your courage, if not your judgment, bringing that broken-down mare to compete against real racehorses." Jake ignored the taunt, focusing on the registration process. Hope's papers were in order, their entry fee had been paid, and according to territorial racing law, she had the right to compete regardless of any ongoing legal disputes. The race official, a weathered man named Collins, who'd been running territorial events for 20 years, studied their documentation with professional thoroughness. "Everything seems to be in order," he said finally, stamping their entry with official approval. "Race starts in 2 hours. Good luck, son." As Jake led Hope toward the preparation area, he caught sight of the crowd that had gathered to watch the proceedings. Word of their story had spread, and people had come from hundreds of miles away to witness what many saw as the ultimate David versus Goliath confrontation. In the crowd, Jake spotted faces he recognized: old Pete, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, townspeople from home who'd made the journey to support them, and scattered throughout, Men and women whose hard lives had taught them to value the kind of courage that fought impossible battles for the right reasons. Hope seemed to draw energy from the attention, her head held high, her movements fluid and confident. Whatever fear she'd carried from her abuse had been burned away by weeks of trust and care, leaving behind the natural athlete she'd always been meant to be. "She knows," Sarah whispered, watching Hope's transformation. "She knows this is her moment." Jake nodded, feeling the truth of it in his bones. This wasn't just about winning a race or keeping a horse. This was about redemption for Hope, for himself, for everyone who'd ever been dismissed as worthless by those with power and money. The call came for jockeys to mount their horses. Jake swung up onto Hope's back, feeling the familiar strength of her body beneath him, the perfect balance that came from weeks of working together as a team. "Ready, girl?" he asked softly. Hope's answer was to prance sideways toward the starting line, her entire being focused on the track ahead. She was ready. They both were. The greatest race of their lives was about to begin. The starting gun gleamed silver in the morning sun, held steady in the race official's weathered hand. Jake could feel Hope's muscles coiled beneath him, like springs wound too tight, her entire body trembling with barely contained energy. Around them, 15 other horses and riders waited for the signal that would unleash weeks of preparation into one explosive moment of truth. Thunderstrike stood 3 positions to their left, his professional jockey dressed in Webb's colors of gold and black. The California horse looked every inch the champion, perfectly groomed, supremely conditioned, radiating the arrogant confidence of a horse that had never tasted defeat. His jockey, a small, hard-faced man named Martinez, had ridden winners at tracks across the West and carried himself with the easy assurance of proven superiority. Jake wore his father's old racing silks, faded blue and white cotton that had seen better days but carried the weight of memory and hope. Hope's tack was simply well-oiled saddle and bridle that Jake had carefully adjusted for maximum comfort and control. They looked like what they were, underdogs with everything to prove and nothing left to lose. The crowd had swelled to nearly 1,000 people, word of the story having spread across the territory like wildfire. Spectators lined the mile-long track, their voices creating a constant buzz of excitement and speculation. Jake caught glimpses of familiar faces in the throng. Sarah, her hands pressed to her heart. Dr. Miller, his expression grave with concern. Old Pete, tears streaming down his cheeks as he watched the mare he'd first known as Desert Wind prepare for her comeback. But it was the other horses that commanded Jake's immediate attention. Besides Thunderstrike, there were 3 other serious contenders: a gray stallion from Colorado, known for his closing speed, a black mare from New Mexico, with a reputation for tactical racing, and a bay gelding from Texas, whose raw power had made him legendary in ranch country. "Riders ready," Collins called out, raising the starting gun. Hope's ears swiveled back toward Jake's voice as he whispered final words of encouragement. "This is it, girl. Everything we've worked for comes down to the next few minutes. I trust you completely." Hope's response was to settle deeper into her crouch, her hindquarters gathering beneath her like a cat preparing to pounce. Jake could feel the power in her body, the coiled energy that weeks of careful training had developed into a weapon of pure speed. The silence stretched impossibly long, broken only by the snorting of horses and the creaking of leather. Jake's world narrowed to the track ahead, the warm strength of hope beneath him, and the silver glint of the starting gun catching the morning light. The gun fired. Hope exploded from the line with such sudden violence that Jake nearly lost his seat. Her powerful hindquarters drove them forward like a cannonball, and within 3 strides she was moving faster than Jake had ever experienced. The ground blurred beneath them as Hope found her rhythm, her hooves eating up the packed earth with mechanical precision. But they weren't alone in their explosive start. Thunderstrike had broken clean as well, Martinez expertly positioning the champion on the inside rail where he could control the pace. The gray stallion from Colorado was running 3rd, with the black mare from New Mexico settling into 4th position. Jake fought the urge to ask Hope for more speed. They had a mile to cover, and experience had taught him that races were won in the final quarter, not the first. Hope seemed to understand the strategy instinctively, running within herself while maintaining contact with the leaders. The first quarter-mile passed in a blur of thundering hooves and flying dirt. Thunderstrike led by a length, his professional jockey content to set a fast but sustainable pace. Hope ran easily in second, her breathing steady, her stride fluid and efficient. Jake could feel the power she was holding in reserve, the speed that weeks of desert training had built into her muscles and lungs. As they passed the half-mile marker, Jake caught a glimpse of the crowd and was stunned by what he saw. Nearly every person was on their feet, shouting and cheering with an intensity that spoke of investment beyond mere entertainment. This had become more than a horse. Race It was a battle between different philosophies, different ways of seeing the world. Martinez made his first tactical move as they entered the backstretch, allowing Thunderstrike to drift slightly wide and opening a gap on the rail. It was an invitation and a challenge you take, the shorter route if you're brave enough to risk being trapped against the inside. Jake accepted the challenge without hesitation, guiding Hope toward the rail with gentle pressure from his knees. Hope responded instantly, angling inward and finding the gap just as it started to close. For a heart-stopping moment, they were trapped between Thunderstrike and the inside rail, boxed in with nowhere to go. But Hope had faced worse traps than this, drawing on reserves of courage that had been forged in abuse and tempered by kindness. She squeezed through the narrowing gap with inches to spare. Jake felt Martinez's surprised curse as they slipped past Thunderstrike's shoulder and onto the rail in perfect position. The crowd's roar doubled in volume as Hope took the lead for the first time. Jake could hear individual voices now, Sarah screaming his name, old Pete's wordless whoops of joy, the deeper rumble of men who understood what they were witnessing. Hope's ears flicked back at the sound, and Jake felt her stride lengthen slightly in response to the encouragement. 3/4 of a mile down, 1/4 to go. Thunderstrike was right behind them, Martinez having abandoned tactical patience in favor of raw pursuit. The champion horse was everything his reputation claimed: powerful, determined, and utterly professional in his approach to racing. But Jake could sense something in Thunderstrike's breathing, a slight laboring that suggested the early pace might have taken more out of him than expected. The gray stallion from Colorado was making his move on the outside, his jockey having waited for exactly this moment to unleash his horse's legendary closing speed. The black mare was fading slightly, her tactical race having failed to position her for a winning strike. As they entered the final turn, Jake made a decision that would have terrified him weeks ago, but now felt as natural as breathing. Instead of asking Hope to maintain their current pace, he gave her permission to run. "Now, girl," he whispered, "show them who you really are." Hope's response was immediate and devastating. Her stride opened up like a flower blooming, each movement carrying them further ahead of the pack. This wasn't the desperate speed of a horse being pushed beyond its limits. This was the fluid, effortless velocity of a natural athlete operating at the peak of her abilities. Martinez felt his mount beginning to struggle and responded with whip and spur, demanding more speed from Thunderstrike than the horse had left to give. The champion gamely tried to respond, but weeks of easy living and professional care couldn't match the desert-forged endurance that Hope had developed during their fugitive existence. The grey stallion was making a valiant effort on the outside, his closing speed bringing him within striking distance. But Jake could see that Hope had more to give, could feel the reserves of power that patient training had built into her frame. As they straightened into the final stretch, Hope was leading by 2 lengths and pulling away. Her breathing was deep but steady, her stride still fluid and controlled. Behind them, Thunderstrike was beginning to fade, Martinez's desperate urgings unable to find speed that simply wasn't there. The crowd had gone beyond cheering into something approaching religious fervor. 1,000 voices were shouting Hope's name, willing her toward the finish line with an intensity that spoke of shared dreams and vicarious triumph. 100 yards to go, and Hope was flying. The winner's circle wreath was woven from desert wildflowers' simple blooms that had learned to thrive in harsh conditions, much like the mare who was about to claim them. Jake could see the finish line approaching with crystalline clarity, every detail etched in his memory forever. The flutter of the checkered flag, the race official's raised hand, the blur of faces in the crowd united in a single moment of shared triumph. Hope's final surge defied every law of physics and probability. With 50 yards to go, she wasn't just winning, she was dominating, her lead stretching to 4 lengths as Thunderstrike finally succumbed to the relentless pace. The gray stallion from Colorado was making a desperate late charge, but Hope had found another gear, a reserve of speed that seemed to come from somewhere beyond mere muscle and bone. Jake felt tears streaming down his cheeks as they flashed under the wire. Hope's victory so complete and overwhelming that even Martinez raised his whip in salute as they passed. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a sound that seemed to shake the very mountains surrounding the racetrack. But it was Hope herself who moved Jake most profoundly. As they crossed the finish line and began to slow, she wasn't labored or exhausted, she was exhilarated. Her head was high, her ears pricked forward, and Jake could feel the joy radiating from her powerful frame. This was what she had been born to do, what cruel men had tried to destroy, what love and patience had restored. The official time was announced as they entered the winner's circle. 1 minute, 37 seconds for the mile. It was a territorial record, a time that would have won races at Churchill Downs or Belmont Park. Hope hadn't just beaten the competition, she had announced herself as one of the finest racehorses the American West had ever produced. Marcus Webb stood at the edge of the winner's circle, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. The legal documents that had seemed so powerful just hours ago now looked like paper shields against a hurricane. How could he claim that this magnificent, triumphant mare was the same broken-down animal he'd tried to seize through legal maneuvering? Sarah reached them first, tears of joy streaming down her face as she threw her arms around Hope's neck. "You did it," she whispered. "You beautiful, magnificent girl. You did it." Dr. Miller was close behind, his professional composure completely abandoned as he whooped like a schoolboy. 37 seconds. Jake, do you understand what that means? She's not just fast, she's historically fast. Old Pete's arrival was the most moving of all. The ancient cowboy approached Hope with reverence, his weathered hands shaking as he reached up to touch her muzzle. "Desert wind," he whispered. "Sweet desert wind, you came back to us." Hope seemed to recognize something in the old man's touch, nuzzling his palm with gentle affection. It was a moment of connection that transcended time, linking past and present in a gesture of mutual recognition and respect. The presentation of the winner's wreath was handled by Collins, the race official whose weathered face bore the satisfied expression of a man who'd witnessed something special. As he placed the simple circle of wildflowers around Hope's neck, he spoke words that would be remembered long after the cheers faded. "Ladies and gentlemen, in 30 years of running territorial races, I've never seen anything like what we witnessed today. This mare didn't just win a race-ish, reminded us all why we love these magnificent animals in the first place." The winner's purse was $500 in gold coin, more money than Jake had ever held at one time. But as Collins counted out the payment into Jake's shaking hands, the cowboy was already thinking beyond immediate wealth. This money would buy them legal protection, secure their future, and ensure that Hope would never again face the kind of cruelty that had nearly destroyed her. Webb made one final attempt at intimidation, approaching Jake with his lawyer in tow and his pale eyes cold with defeat. "This doesn't change anything, Morrison," he said through gritted teeth. "That horse is still stolen property, regardless of how fast she runs." But Collins overheard the exchange and stepped forward with the authority of territorial racing law behind him. "Mr. Webb, Hope is now officially registered as the territorial champion under Jake Morrison's ownership. Any legal challenges to that status will need to go through proper channels and could take years to resolve." Webb's lawyer whispered something urgent in his employer's ear. and Jake caught the words public opinion and impossible to win. The crowd's adoration of Hope had transformed the legal landscape, making it virtually impossible for Webb to pursue his claims without appearing to be a vindictive bully attacking a beloved champion. "This isn't over," Webb muttered, but Jake could hear the defeat in his voice. "Yes, it is," Jake replied quietly. "It's been over since the moment you decided that cruelty was stronger than love. Hope just proved you wrong." As Webb and his entourage departed, the celebration continued around them. Hope stood calmly in the winner's circle, accepting the adoration of the crowd with the dignified grace of a queen holding court. The simple wreath of wildflowers had become a crown, and the broken mare from the auction had been transformed into territorial royalty. Jake dismounted and stood beside Hope, one hand resting on her neck as photographers captured the moment for newspapers across the West. In the images that would appear on front pages from Denver to San Francisco, viewers would see a poor cowboy and his remarkable horse, but Jake knew the truth was deeper than any photograph could capture. This was a story about redemption, not just Hope's transformation from broken animal to champion, but his own journey from aimless drifter to a man who'd found his purpose. They had saved each other, he realized, each providing what the other needed most desperately. As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate excitement faded into satisfied exhaustion, Jake found himself alone with Hope for the first time since their victory. She was grazing peacefully on the sparse grass near the winner's circle, the wreath still around her neck, looking for all the world like a horse who'd never doubted this moment would come. "We did it, girl," Jake said softly, stroking her neck with hands that had learned to read her moods like scripture. "We actually did it." Hope looked up from her grazing and fixed him with those dark, intelligent eyes that had first captured his heart at the auction. In their depths, Jake saw not just satisfaction, but something deeper, a sense of completion, of destiny fulfilled, of a promise kept across the years. The territorial championship was theirs. Hope was safe. Their future was secure. But more than any of that, they had proven that sometimes, just sometimes, love really could triumph over money and power and cruelty. In a world that often seemed designed to crush the gentle and reward the ruthless, they had written a different ending. And in the growing twilight of that perfect day, with Hope's victory wreath catching the last rays of desert sun, Jake Morrison knew that he had witnessed something that would sustain him for the rest of his life, the moment when grace triumphed over greed, when patience overcame power, and when a broken horse and a broken man found wholeness in each other. The new deed of ownership was written on heavy paper with an official seal that caught the morning light streaming through the windows of the territorial courthouse. Jake Morrison's name was inscribed in careful script as the legal owner of 160 acres of desert land, free and clear of all encumbrances. But more importantly, the document established Hope's breeding rights and her permanent protection under territorial racing law as a registered champion. 6 months had passed since that triumphant day at the racetrack, and the changes were profound. Jake's small cabin had been expanded into a modest ranch house with a proper barn and training facilities that drew visitors from across the territory. Hope lived in comfort now, her daily routine, a careful balance of gentle exercise, quality feed, and the kind of care that recognized her not just as a valuable animal, but as a beloved companion. The morning routine had become sacred to both of them. Jake would arrive at Hope's paddock with coffee steaming in the cool desert air, and she would approach the fence with the eager greeting of a horse who had never forgotten what it meant to be cherished. Her coat gleamed with health, her eyes held the calm confidence of an animal who knew herself to be valued, and when she moved across her pasture, observers could still catch glimpses of the magnificent speed that had made her legendary. Sarah had become more than just a friend and supporter. The general store now bore the sign Morrison Chen, reflecting their partnership in both business and life. She managed the ranch's breeding program with the same efficient intelligence she'd brought to her store, and Hope had responded to her care with the gentle affection reserved for those who truly understood horses. 3 mares are in foal, Sarah announced, reviewing the breeding records as they shared breakfast on the porch. Doc Miller thinks they'll deliver in the spring, if even one of them inherits Hope's speed. Jake nodded, but his satisfaction came from a deeper source than potential racing success. Hope had found peace, and that was worth more than all the champion foals in the world. Dr. Miller had become a regular visitor, officially serving as the ranch's veterinarian but unofficially acting as family. His examination of Hope the previous week had confirmed what Jake already knew from daily observations. She was as healthy and content as any horse he'd ever treated. She's put on weight, her muscle tone is excellent, and her attitude. Doc Miller had paused, searching for the right words. She's happy, Jake. Really, truly happy. You can see it in everything she does. The transformation extended beyond Hope to the entire community. Jake's victory had become the stuff of local legend, retold in saloons and around campfires with the kind of embellishment that turned historical fact into enduring myth. But the core truth remained unchanged. Love and patience had triumphed over wealth and cruelty in the most public way possible. Marcus Webb had departed the territory shortly after the race, selling his holdings to a consortium of local ranchers and retreating to California with his tail between his legs. Word had filtered back that he'd given up horse racing entirely, focusing instead on cattle ranching, where the animal's spirits were less likely to embarrass him publicly. Tom Bradley had been quietly dismissed from his position as foreman when his connection to Webb's schemes became public knowledge. He drifted south toward Mexico, carrying with him the bitter lesson that cruelty often consumed those who practiced it as surely as it harmed its intended victims. But it was the small changes that moved Jake most deeply. Hope's trust had become absolute, their communication so refined that a gesture or a word could convey complex intentions. She would follow him without a halter, stand calmly for grooming and veterinary care, and demonstrate the kind of willing cooperation that could only come from an animal who felt truly safe. The racing world had taken notice as well. Offers arrived regularly from wealthy horsemen wanting to buy Hope's foals, lease her breeding services, or arrange matches against other champions. Jake considered each proposal carefully, but had yet to accept any that would require Hope to leave the ranch or submit to the stress of competition. She's earned her retirement, he would tell persistent suitors. If her foals want to race, that's their choice to make. But Hope's racing days are behind her. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Jake walked out to Hope's pasture with a special purpose. Today marked exactly 1 year since he'd bought her at that dusty auction, and he wanted to commemorate the anniversary in a way that honored their journey together. Hope approached him with the eager curiosity that had replaced her initial fear. At Jake's invitation, she followed him to the flat stretch where they'd first discovered her speed, the same ground where he'd realized he was caring for a legend. But instead of asking her to run, Jake simply stood with her in the morning stillness, his hand resting on her neck as they watched the sun rise over the mountains. There was no need for speed trials or demonstrations of ability. They had nothing left to prove to the world or to each other. "A year ago, nobody wanted you but me," Jake said quietly. "Today, you're the most famous horse in 3 territories. But you know what? You're still the same gentle soul who trusted a stranger with calloused hands and an empty pocket." Hope turned to look at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that had first captured his heart. In their depths, Jake saw contentment, security, and something that might have been gratitude. The sound of approaching hooves interrupted the moment. Sarah was riding out to join them, as she did most mornings, her presence completing the small family they'd created. Behind her came old Pete, now employed as the ranch's head trainer, and Dr. Miller, who had developed the habit of stopping by for coffee and conversation. "Another perfect morning," Sarah observed, dismounting and moving to stroke Hope's muzzle. The mare accepted her attention with pleased rumbling, a sound of contentment that had become as familiar as birdsong. "Every morning's perfect when you're living the life you were meant to live," Jake replied, surprising himself with the philosophical nature of the observation. Pete chuckled, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. "Never thought I'd see the day when Desert Wind would be running free in her own pasture, surrounded by folks who understand her worth." It was true. Hope's story had become a beacon for others who believed in the value of patience over force, love over domination. Visitors came regularly, not to gawk at a famous racehorse, but to witness proof that kindness could overcome the cruelest circumstances. Later that day, as the anniversary celebration continued, with a simple meal shared among friends, Jake found himself reflecting on the lessons Hope had taught him. He'd learned that healing took time, that trust was earned through consistent kindness, and that sometimes the most broken things could become the most beautiful when given proper care. But perhaps most importantly, he'd learned that every creature, human or animal, deserved to be seen for their potential rather than judged by their current circumstances. Hope had been dismissed as worthless by everyone except one man who chose to see possibility where others saw only problems. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Jake stood at his fence watching Hope graze peacefully in her pasture. The territorial championship trophy sat on his mantle, the prize money had secured their future, and the legal documents guaranteed their safety. But the real treasure was simpler and more profound than any external validation. It was the daily miracle of watching a once broken spirit learn to trust again, the quiet satisfaction of providing a safe haven for a creature who had known too much cruelty, and the deep joy that came from understanding that he had been part of something redemptive and true. In the growing darkness, Hope lifted her head and looked toward the house where warm light spilled from the windows. She nickered softly, a sound of recognition and affection that carried across the desert air like a benediction. Jake Morrison, poor cowboy who had bought a broken horse with his last $2, smiled and headed inside to join his family. Behind him, Hope continued grazing in perfect contentment, her coat gleaming in the starlight, her spirit finally, completely, and forever whole. Sometimes the most beautiful connections really do happen between two souls that the world has given up on. And sometimes, with enough patience and love, those connections can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities, proving that grace exists in the most unexpected places and that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to believe in it. The story of Jake Morrison and Hope had become legend, but its truth was simpler and more profound than any myth. It was proof that in a world often dominated by power and greed, there was still room for kindness to triumph. Still space for the gentle to inherit something more valuable than earth. They could inherit the hearts of all who witnessed their victory.